In a study conducted last year at Workable, it was found that since the outbreak of the pandemic, 42% of companies stepped up their upskilling and reskilling efforts, and that 42% of employees pursue training on their own. Those are big numbers, and they are heartening. To discuss the landscape of upskilling, Taylor Jr., reskilling, and continuing education, we're joined by an all-star lineup of experts. Andy Van Kleunen is the CEO of the National Skills Coalition, an organization that advocates for inclusive, high-quality skills training. He is way cool. Plinio Ayala is CEO and president of Scholas, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, an organization that trains workers for in-demand technical roles. Get on their Twitter feed. They do really great stuff, and they are great communicators. Angie Kamath is the Dean for Continuing Education at Workforce Development at the City University of New York. And Nancy LeaMond is Executive Vice President, Chief Advocacy and Engagement Officer at AARP. It's great to have all of you here. I think this will just make this kind of like the View format. Any of you can jump in and finish each other's sentences, on this. But Andy, let me start with you. I mean, you just go right to them. You kind of go right after, Andrew Sorkin and CNBC and Squawk Box and say, look, in your coverage of the Biden plan, why don't you, listen to Mark Zandi and go out there and try to figure out how to get the many hundreds of thousands of laid off workers in the restaurant industry retrained for jobs in the infrastructure area. This goes right to what I was discussing with Brian Hendricks a moment ago, which is why aren't we more nimble? Or maybe we are and I don't know it. But what is impeding our ability to create credentialing, training, partnerships, and just kind of begin moving talent in the right places in this nation in a way that doesn't feel like such a lift?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, Steve. I actually think that we as a country, in local industries, in colleges like Angie's, and the work that Plinio is doing, we actually know a lot about this. Our challenge is that we don't have public policies that want to scale this. So, we want employers to be at the table when we think about what kind of retraining we want, but we don't invest in. So
I just want to interrupt you there for a minute, Andy, because you said something important. You said we don't have public policies that want to scale this. I just want to underline that for a moment. That's a big statement. So please go further. I just wanted to emphasize I heard that. I want everybody else here. It's a big statement.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk currently about kind of where we as a country rank in our physical infrastructure investments relative to the rest of the world. And we're pretty low on this scale, but we're even lower on the scale in terms of active labor market policies. Not just how do we invest in people's training to get them their first job. And we have millions of people that we need to kind of get into a job who are currently unemployed or marginally employed because of the pandemic. But we have tens of millions of folks who are at risk of losing their job because of all the things that you've talked about over the past 2 hours. Technology changing workplaces, transforming industries, and we don't have a strategy to actually train the tens of millions of folks who are currently in the workforce to figure out how to keep their skills ahead of the technological curve. And so it's both an employment challenge, but it's also an upskilling and advancement challenge, and we just don't have the policy apparatus there to do it. I will say, with the recent proposals from the Biden administration, both the jobs plan that we got a little while ago and the families plan that we got today, we may be finally turning the corner on this. And we're very excited about what some of the potential is for some of those proposals. We just want to make sure that they're bringing industry to the table to figure out how to use these dollars on the ground, and that we're making them as flexible as possible, not just for new workers who are entering our industry for the first time, but for folks who are currently employed and holding on a full-time job.
Thank you. Angie and Plinio, I'm going to get to Nancy in a second, but she'll be my backup hitter here. But Angie and Plinio, when I think about some of the things we've been discussing today and why isn't the U.S. economy somehow more efficient in these areas, what needs to be done? A lot of it, Angie, is, some non-scientific, is stigma about education, stigma about, someone's life experience, and so human resource departments don't want to take risks. Stigma against, oddly enough, lifelong learning and lifelong education. I know you're all working on it, but I'd like to know from your perspective, at one of the great institutions of learning in New York, what are the blocks that we can remove to make this flow better?
Sure. Thanks so much, Steve. There's a couple of things that I think are incredibly important. And I would also like to underscore what Andy said in terms of just policies that really need to enable scaling up of upskilling programs. I think employers don't necessarily care about continuing ed versus associate degrees or graduate degrees or bachelor's degrees. I think we in the education system are very fixated on that. I think employers want really great folks that have competencies that they need, folks that have an ability to learn new competencies, folks that have an ability to really have digital skills, whether those digital skills are in data or in software development or in cybersecurity. I think some of the blocks that we have really are around employer partnerships. I think a lot of employers just have a very traditional way of recruiting talent. You get through an internship in your senior or junior year that then converts to a full-time job. And if you're not in that pipeline, you're kind of shut out of that labor market. And that's not a very competency-driven hiring plan. It's not a very inclusive hiring pathway. It's not a very good pathway for kind of making sure that the skills are available. And so I think some of the blocks are just making sure that we've got some really great commitments from employers to work hand in hand with the academy, not just for short-term silver bullet training, but for long-term training, for degree programs. We've had some exceptional work over the past year with the New York Jobs CEO Council, a tremendous partnership with 28 firms, of the largest firms in New York City, who have really pledged to make hiring commitments to create micro-credentials that advantage students who go through and complete competency-based credentialing to be advantaged in the hiring and interview process. And those are the types of system changes that I think we'd like to see more of. And so I think, Steve, some of those are, blocks and perception issues, I think, of employers, of consumers, of students. And I think that the idea of really making sure that we've got an ability to partner industry with educational providers is incredibly important, and a real commitment to hiring and making sure that the curriculum, whether it's short-term, long-term degree, is really career connected. Those are some of the pieces that I think come to mind.
Thank you. I mean, we're going to get to Nancy in a minute, but I mean, the ageism, the other forms of discrimination that are against the hiring. I mean, there's so many people just operating from inertia in this business. I've sort of found that we need to shake that up a little bit. Plinio, you are shaking it up, and I just sort of feel like maybe we, particularly in the tech area, we just ought to subcontract you to fix all this, because you're training people in tech training for free. Now, I don't know how you're doing that, but tell us what you are doing. And can you train some of Nancy LeaMond's people, because they're very interested. We're going to get to that in a second.
First of all, thank you for including me this afternoon. Just to add a bit about what Angie talked about, certainly there is this need, I think, for this nation to redefine post-secondary education. I think we often pigeonhole our young people or our adults that college is the only answer, and there are organizations like Scholas that can provide these short-term interventions that can move people into these amazing IT jobs that lead to incredible IT careers. And I think as a nation, we need to embrace that. And employers, I believe, at this point in time, are beginning to do that. I think Representative Stevens talked about the jobs that are in demand now, that exist now, that are going unfilled. I think it's a business imperative for employers to think differently about hiring, to look at pipelines of talent that organizations like Scholas can build for them as a viable solution to some of the jobs that are going unfilled right now. I think that mindset is beginning to change. And I think as a nation, we need to take advantage of that to scale what works. I think, to underscore what Andy began us with, this idea that this nation is beginning to think about investing in workforce development in a very large way. We're very excited about what the Biden administration is proposing. My suggestion is that we really think about how we do that strategically and intelligently, right? How do we invest in models that are effective, models that work, that have proven outcomes? If we're going to all invest in, let's say, energy stocks, we'd find 2 or 3 companies that we want to invest in that would realize a good return for us, and that's where we put our money. We wouldn't put it in companies that we would perhaps lose our investments. And so I think public dollars should be invested the same way. When you look at an organization like Scholas, who's gone through 2 random control trials, the most recent one indicated that the return on the investment is huge. For every dollar invested in Scholas, you get $8 back. It's an 800% return. That's an amazing return in anyone's book. Right. There are a lot of models like Scholas out there that work. Yeah. We just need to invest in those that are most effective.
I really love it. I want to come back to you, all in a moment, kind of tell us about, life stories you've changed. But I want to jump to Nancy LeaMond. And Nancy, I don't know if you did this on purpose, but I got an email. When I get an email from Nancy, I get this little alert, and it pops up on my screen while I was doing this show. And so I while I was sneaking and saying, oh God, what did Nancy send to me? And it was basically about entrepreneurs in the 50-plus area, about incumbent workforce, and about she gave a talk, which I quietly, lip read what you were saying at the New York Federal Reserve Board, with regards to, some of our elder American citizens and the talents there, and how, we kind of underestimate. I mean, I actually once, I'll shut up in a minute. I actually, interviewed Nancy once, and she said, look, I am in the American AARP, but the future of retirement is work. It's the greatest line I've heard. So, Nancy, I'd love to, as we kind of think about these questions of our workforce, and oftentimes there is an age bias in this of looking, as Angie just said, at the people. But if you look at most of our university today, the reality is we have non-traditional students dominating in a lot of these schools and universities, and they continue to be engaged, relevant, and innovative. And so tell us what we need to know about this frame, and then we're going to have our three other panelists come in and respond to you.
Sure. Well, you make a terrific point. Talk about a perception issue. I think, though we all kind of know better, people tend to think you reach the age of 60, 65, and you leave the workforce, and you are either playing golf, sitting on your porch, having an all-day book group. I don't know what the view is, but the fact is, for the last 20 years, there's been a steady increase in the number of older Americans in the workforce. There's also, as you point out, a steady increase of entrepreneurs over the age of 55. You referred to a program we did with the Federal Reserve in New York, where we looked at the impact of COVID on that group. Devastating. And they were largely older entrepreneurs. Another point I'd love to make is that, we all think the gig economy was invented for millennials, and that it's a world of T-shirts and skinny jeans. But the reality is, pre-COVID, a third of the so-called gig workforce were older workers. And so you see this pattern. And of course, people are living longer. They want to stay engaged longer. And also they have to, and this is an important point, 50%, half of people turning the age of 50 have virtually no retirement savings. So what that tells you is that older workers are here to stay. Similarly, another kind of myth is that older workers aren't interested in or won't deal with technology. And again, that's not true. We are not digital natives, obviously, but many of us use technology in our jobs. And importantly, COVID showed us, if not in the job world, then certainly in the world of your quality of life, you need to know how to go online. Anybody who wanted to get a vaccine had a 90% greater chance of getting it if they could go online than if they went to a 1-800 number, which, by the way, told you to go online after you talked to them. These are all things that are absolutely evident, along with an issue we don't talk about very much, and that's age discrimination. And we have countless studies that show that a vast number of people over the age of 50 believe there is age discrimination in the workforce. There's evidence in terms of cases with the EEOC. I think one of you mentioned the way companies hire, and many of them use devices on your resume to see how old you are, track things like that. We're going to have to deal with this, because to be a strong economy, as I think all of you mentioned, and as Brian underscored, we're going to need the full force of older workers.
Yeah, well, I've mentioned it all the time. Andy, I really appreciate that perspective, and I would love to tell people you can see Nancy in this very interesting forum, very serious forum of the New York Federal Reserve Board on entrepreneurs, on the 50-plus community. It's very, very interesting, done at the end of March. But Andy, let me come back to all of you, but Andy first. Years ago when I worked in the United States Senate in the 1990s for Jeff Bingaman, think of Roswell, New Mexico. Roswell was famous for more things than Area 51, but it had a big bus making factory. We made big buses. They had a Levi's factory there. These two plants shut down, and the assessment was made that trade had impacted them. So through trade adjustment assistance, we supposedly gave retraining to these people. And the truth is, in the 1990s, we were crappy at it. We didn't retrain anyone. It was a fig leaf over impacts in people's lives. Have we gotten better at training, in the last 25 years? Do we have greater ability? Does Scholas, does the National Skills, Coalition, are we able to take those people that are incumbent workers and begin moving them in real ways as opposed to fake ways, like we used to promise in the past but never delivered?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that we know how to train folks for local industry if local industry is involved in figuring out what the training should be. Full stop. And I think if we have policies that enable that and support that and bring employers and unions and colleges and community organizations and others together to kind of figure out that strategy, we have excellent outcomes from that kind of training. I think the point that you make around laid off manufacturing workers and things that I think we have not done yet, but again, props to the Biden administration, both in the proposals around rethinking dislocated worker policy that was proposed under the jobs plan and indexing UI reform, unemployment insurance reform that was talked about in the families plan released today, is that we need to kind of see training as part of a package of things that we're doing, which include income support and healthcare support and other kinds of support services, and to give folks enough time to make a pretty significant transition in their lives. If they've been working in the same industry, in the same occupation for 30 years, you just don't turn on a dime with that. And we should be doing that whether you've been displaced because of trade or technology or a pandemic or even a downturn in the business cycle. And it's time that we kind of get past this categorical differentiation about why you lost your job and fully investing in how it is we're going to get you back into some kind of work and to keep you whole while you're doing that.
Per, I would love to get your thoughts on the training piece of this and whether or not you think we've gotten past that moment where we can now push reset and we actually can, as Andy said, make greater inroads in this.
Yes, I think we
Plinio.
can. I think we've learned that getting employers involved at the very beginning in designing these models is incredibly imperative. And I think there are a lot of organizations that have embraced this idea of employer-led training. And that's led to some significant results in organizations across the country. I think that approach, and I think what Andy talked about also, in making sure that all of the right players are at the table talking about this solution and informing what is the right program in a particular geography, I think allows us to have the best shot at making this work.
Plinio, do you have a favorite story of someone whose life you've turned around through Scholas?
Yes, actually, let me share the story of Nicholas. Nicholas was a ramp agent at BWI Airport, lost his job in November as a result of the pandemic, and didn't know where to go next. Found a flyer on this organization called Scholas, enrolled in the initiative in November, and graduated just a couple of months ago with 2 industry recognized certifications. And within 30 days of graduation, landed a job as a systems administrator for one of the major companies in Baltimore, earning 25% more than what he was in his previous job. There are so many stories like Nicholas's that we can share, thousands of Americans across this country that are getting our training and getting jobs in the industry. It's truly a remarkable program, and the impact is significant.
Angie, I would love to get your response on this, and just tell me, if you have a favorite student in the retraining, workforce retraining arena.
Sure. So, I often think about kind of if I had the magic wand, kind of what would we do? And I think this world of workforce development is sometimes complicated, right? Because there isn't a silver bullet. It's not just do this training. It's this combination of what will put individuals on a path to economic mobility and really kind of sustainability and choice-filled lives. It's this combination of work experience and some upskilling, having the right skills that will kind of future-proof their job prospects. And so I think that, I think a lot about things like data science for all, again, at any age, not just kind of an educational perspective, but I think about some programs that we had really right before the pandemic, but they've become really incredibly important now. Data analytics in healthcare and in public healthcare in particular. We work with our local public hospital system, and we were able to kind of create programs through LaGuardia Community College that really help to ensure that frontline healthcare workers that were pretty at the entry level were able to get data analytics training so that they could help in terms of social determinants of health, and really try to understand what is important about community healthcare and kind of how we can make it better. And so, in terms of a particular program about a particular student, I think about the cohorts of folks who go through these employer-led trainings where they really are being invested in by their employers. They can understand the bigger picture, they can understand the trajectory, and that feels incredibly important. I also think that, in addition to something like data analytics, which just feels like a really ubiquitous skill set that could be really required for everyone, I think it's important, you named it, that not every job is that first, kind of gateway job. We need to really think about our policies and our programs that not only train folks for that first job, but that are mid-career and that are really kind of focused on long-term jobs. And I think that a lot of training programs are funded to kind of do training and then get people into a job that really looks at a wage level. And I actually think that's just so simplistic in terms of people and trajectories and kind of what they want out of careers. And so those are some of the pieces that I think, Plinio and Andy and Nancy's remarks really sparked for me.
It's really, really important. I am kind of obsessed with this topic, and I want to just give Nancy the last word, because there's some dimensions, and Nancy and I have known each other a long time. And so one of the big issues for Nancy LeaMond, if I can put it on the table, is the fragility of the economic circumstances, particularly of women, elder women, but of elder Americans. And so, when you're kind of looking, as you just said, they're scrambling to pay the bills, do this, and we're talking about retraining. My experiences, and it may have changed, and we'll have to have a part 2 to this conversation down the road to find out. My experience is knowing someone who was laid off 4 times at a high-tech company, trained his successor from a foreign country, and then decided he couldn't take it anymore and wanted to go into healthcare. And now he's a much-loved nurse at a local elder care facility. But it cost him about $65,000 to pay for that, through which most of his family and friends helped him pay for this. So we talk about retraining. Per Scholas, I know, is free. I assume there are resources out there. But Nancy, as we talk about the economic fragility in this, I don't want to be cavalier. There are real costs for real people, even as we talk about, the importance of transitioning. Am I wrong or am I right?
No, absolutely. And I think one of the factors in people's minds about getting retraining is, can I afford to make this investment? And if I can, am I going to get a job at the end of it? And I think the more we can partner, and I'm delighted by this conversation, with groups that can provide training at a reasonable cost and provide opportunities that may well materialize, we'll be in much better shape. AARP, in addition to our policy and our advocacy work, for 45 years has been one of the major implementers of the Department of Labor's Senior Community Service Employment Program. And so we have some firsthand knowledge of how do you train older workers. We have been working right before the pandemic. We were working on an agreement with a number of community colleges to include older students in their advanced manufacturing training programs. And I believe, to the point I think all 3 of my colleagues here have made, that the training has to be different than it's been kind of historically, and also very geographically and industry focused. And that's the key. And I couldn't agree more that we need to knit together all of these wonderful opportunities that you've described, that Brian described right before us, and move ahead. There is no question that older Americans need to be in the workforce. And if they aren't, it is a major, major issue for the economy and for poverty in this country.
Well, let's make a deal that I want to have a part 2 to this conversation. I want to talk about what's happening at the City University of New York on this, but digital platforms, digital education. I've been on with the Coursera's. I, secretly, sign on to some SalCons, do some calculus brush up, and all of these kinds of things are out there, and I'd love to kind of learn more about how we can, in this time of what we learned from the pandemic, reach people where they are, using compelling digital platforms and what we've learned to help give these people skills, whether they are in West Virginia or Montana or Mobile, Alabama. There are lots of folks out there that can be reached in new ways. So we'll leave this as a part 1 of a needed part 2 discussion. I want to thank Andy Van Kleunen, CEO of National Skills Coalition, Plinio Ayala, CEO and President per Scholas, Angie Kamath, Dean for Continuing Education and Workforce Development at the City University of New York. Love CUNY, and Nancy LeaMond, Executive Vice President, Chief Advocacy and Engagement Officer at AARP. Thank you all so much. Great conversation.
Thank you, Steve.